Would you please begin by telling me your name and where you were born and when you were born?
Okay, my name is Francine Taylor, and I was born in July 14th, 1928 in Kharkiv, Poland. That's that's a suburb right outside of Warsaw, 30 minutes by train.
And what was your Polish name?
And my Polish name was Frajda
And your maiden name?
Eisenstark.
And what does that mean?
Eisen means iron, stark means strong, and it means in German actually strong as iron.
And had your family been in that community for many years or generations?
Yes. My mother's maiden name was Königsberg, which is named after the city of Königsberg in Germany also. But they were, as far as I can remember and told, they've been there for many generations in that vicinity right around Warsaw.
Do you remember anything of that community, of that town?
Well, yes, because, well, first my family immigrated to Paris, France, and I was only 2 years old in 1930. But it just so happened that in 1938, my mother, my sister, and I went back for a 3 months vacation there. So I was already, 10 years old, and so I remember everything quite well, even though when I first came to France I couldn't speak Polish, but when I returned and was there for a whole 3 months, I speak Yiddish, but I learned Polish also. It was a very lovely little place. Actually, I was born in Kharkiv, that's where my father comes from, and my mother comes from a little town that touches Kharkiv named Otvatsk. And that was a resort town. It was very beautiful. Otvatsk was sort of a rich little town where wealthy people came and spent their vacations. So the Jewish community there was a little bit wealthier than in Kharkiv. And Kharkiv was a real shtetl-like, where the Jews were poor and lived among themselves, like in a ghetto. And my family was very observant, very orthodox, and typical Jewish families was the shetels, and the women that seemed to do all the work, and the men were studying the Talmud all day long. And it was a very colorful summer. Yes, I remember it very, very well.
Do you remember any of the political activity that might have been going on in 1938 when you were there? I know you were only a little girl.
Right. I don't think there were any political activities that I can remember. They were too busy. The Poles, the Gentile Polish population was very anti-Semitic, and I remember that very well. And they were too busy, the Jews, staying away from the Poles and not getting in their way. In fact, I remember one incident where my uncle, I had an uncle in those days who was about 23, 24 years old, lived with my grandmother on my mother's side, and one of his friends, who was Polish, not Jewish, had gone out on the town that weekend and drank a lot, so he came back with a gun and proceeded, and we were visiting there, he was going to kill us all. Jits, he calls us, because we were Jews. And my uncle actually, who was out on the town too, with Jewish boys, came in and saw him through the window, and he had to overpower him and knock him down, or he would have killed us all.
Do you remember any other incidents, any things that happened in the streets, or?
No, that's the only anti-Semitic incident that I remember. I remember there was some kind of a Christian holiday, I don't know what it was, and there was a procession, and the Poles were carrying a statue of the Virgin Mary, and she was electrical in some way. I don't know just how, she operated with a battery, but she had tears coming out her eyes, and the tears were made out of precious stones. I don't know how that worked, but I'll always remember that. And because of the religious holiday, because of this procession, all the Jews went into hiding. They say, stay out of the streets, because that's usually when the Poles like to beat up a few Jews. Now, I remember that. But Other than that, you know, we went to visit the grandparents and the cousins and all that, and we actually, you know, we were children. We had a good time. But Jews lived among Jews, and did not really mix with Christians at all.
Can you tell me why your father and your mother chose to leave the town in the first place and go to France?
Well, then a little later on, my father had a little shop in Warsaw itself, and he, I understand, was doing all right. I mean, he was making a living, but anti-Semitism was very, very strong. And men from France came to recruit labor, and that's what my father told us in Poland. And he was talking at the main square in Warsaw, saying, "Come to France. There's plenty of work. No discrimination, no prejudice. Plenty of work." So my father talked it over with my mother. He says, "Let's leave this country. You know, it sounds so good." And all he had to do is ask for political asylum as a Jew. He could get it. I understand France does that quite easily. So he came, and when he arrived in France, he was told my father was a tailor, that as a tailor there was no work for him. There was work for him in the coal mines. And they wouldn't give him a work permit as a tailor, only as a coal miner. So of course my mother wouldn't let him work in the coal mines. So they remained in Paris without a work permit, and he found work. They lived in a little like fourth class hotel room, terrible place. And he went looking for work, and he found work, but since he didn't have a work permit, anything that would pay, for instance, $1 an hour, he had to work for 25 cents an hour. But he stayed, he remained. He didn't want to go back to Poland.
Did any of his family members come with him?
Yeah, well, not with him, but then a little later, when he finally received a work permit, I don't know just what the procedure was, you know, if he had to stay in France so many years. I know they were there quite some time. Then he brought a younger brother from Poland and his family. And then my mother had a brother who was supposed to be drafted in the Polish army, so he fled Poland at the age of 17, and he came to France and asked for political asylum. As a Jew, you could get it. All they would say is that, you know, they were so anti-Semitic that they didn't want to serve. So he came also, and so my mother, then she brought a younger sister also, and she introduced her to a young Jewish man in Belgium. And she married, and she's still alive. She stayed in Brussels, Belgium. But see, my mother came from a family of 8. 4 of them immigrated, and 4 of them stayed in Poland. And my father, same way, he came from a family of 6. 2 of them stayed in Poland, 4 of them immigrated.
Did you go back again besides the trip in 1938?
No. I could have gone back after the war, but there was nothing to go back to. We, between my father and my mother, we had 56 people, including our grandparents who got shot by the Germans in Poland, and that's close family. I mean, uncles, aunts, grandparents, and first cousins. So we didn't want to go back. There was too many sad memories. I mean, tragic memories, really. Yes.
Well, tell me about France in the 30s as you were growing up in France and your experience as a Jewish child.
All right. Well, we lived in a neighborhood that was 50% Jewish and 50% French middle class. And my parents, of course, couldn't speak French when they arrived. And so until we started school, of course, we picked up French immediately, but we spoke Yiddish in our house. And we didn't encounter really much anti-Semitism, only made fun of our name, Eisenstark, because the French could not pronounce it. They said that was a name to break your teeth on, so casser les dents, as they say. And that's really as children, that's the only anti-Semitism that we encountered. And it was nice. We lived right in the heart of the city, and the schools were good, and my father finally, as I said once, he got a work permit and got work, and then little by little we moved out of this terrible hotel and got a little apartment. It was quite nice on the boulevard. And he became a clothes designer in later years. Didn't enjoy too much because the war came. But the life was nice. I went to public schools, to all-girls school, and my sister too. We walked to school. It was like a 10 minutes walk from where we lived. And
your mother was at home?
And my mother was at home. She helped my father. When he was a tailor, she did all the finishing by hand. And then when he became a clothes designer, he worked at home, my father did. Then she did also all the finishing, the hand finishing with him. So she stayed home, but as I say, she was not employed, but she worked because she helped him.
Were you still an observant family in terms of religious practice?
No, not really, I'll tell you, because my mother and my father came from a very strict religious Orthodox family. And they were, I will say, almost like the revolutionary of their time. They were pretty much against Orthodoxy, you know, as they grew up in, because in my mother's days, I mean, had she remained in Poland and married, they would have shaved her head, put a sheitel on her head, and she thought that was horrible. And of course the men didn't shave, and my father didn't like that, and he didn't like the attire, you know, the black silk coat and all that. But so I wouldn't say we were observant, but we were very Jewish-oriented, you know, as far as observing all the holidays and all the customs and the language and reading and writing. My father taught us. But we really didn't go to shul that much. They didn't have the time, I'll be honest with you. They couldn't observe Saturday. It wasn't possible for them, you know, I mean, Shabbos. But they did the best they could. I mean, we were still brought up pretty much, you know, very much the Jewish way, I'll say. Yes, very much so.
And as time passed and we get into, say, 1938, 39, when did things start to change?
Well, things didn't start to change until the war broke out, and we were always corresponding with a family in Poland, and all at once we couldn't. Of course, France was invaded very quickly. They lost the war. We were in Paris. I remember pulling the shades down and looking through the blinds and seeing the German army walk into Paris, and the streets were deserted. There was not a single soul in the street.
Do you remember any discussion in your family about leaving France to go anywhere else?
Not at the time. Not at the time. We were getting letters from Poland. They were censored then by the German government, you know, and they were saying, we're doing well, we have everything. You know, they sounded real good, but they were always talking about lemons, about having all these lemons. And we couldn't understand why they would say that. Finally, one day, my father caught on, and he said, I presume he says that there is writing between the lines dipped in lemon juice. And he put a regular match, you know, and the smoke of the match brought out writing between the lines.
And what did it say?
And it said that we are starving to death. We expect to be killed any time. The Germans are just horrible, and every day brings a day of terror. And that was the last letter we received, and that was the end. But we did not know what was going on at the time. We did not know until my father, we found out after the war, was in the French underground, but we didn't know it at the time. And he would always talk to us. He would say, oh, things will be all right, things will be all right. Let's just be patient. We will win the war, we will win the war. And he never spoke to us about leaving Paris. Then one day we had to go pick up the Jewish yellow star to sew on our garment. And that's when my father sat us down, and he says, you know, he says, I cannot leave the city. He still didn't tell us why. He says, but if anything happens, if the Germans sometimes decide to maybe come and get all the Jews, he says. He says, then we all each have to run for our life. He says, if one of us becomes separated from the other, he says, don't try to save, don't try to save your mother, don't try to save your sister, just run for your life. But, so we didn't know whether he knew anything or he didn't. He never said.
Were you still going to school at that point after the occupation?
At that point, yeah. At that point, we stayed in Paris until, I think 1942, or yes, because one day I became ill, and the doctor said I had spots on my lungs, and if I wasn't sent into the country for good food and fresh air, I would develop tuberculosis. So we knew of a little boarding place. It was an old couple that took 3 or 4 children in at the time, and it was a small village by Le Mans, about 200 kilometers from Paris.
Which way?
Going towards south. You've heard of the Le Mans races?
Yes.
Right, 40 kilometers from Le Mans. And so they sent me there, and this was the beginning of the summer. School had just let out to stay for the summer. And in the meantime, all hell broke loose.
Could I back you up
Sure.
just a little bit? Could you tell me what went on between the time you saw the German soldiers marching into Paris and the time you went into the country, those 2 years?
Well, we went on to school. Then they put out a curfew. Well, first it was pretty normal. We went on to school, everything was pretty normal. We found out later they were so busy with the Polish Jews, and the other Jews, that they left the Jews in France alone for a while, maybe for a good year or so. I'm just guessing, and then we had to go get our Star of David. And then a curfew, for the Jews there was a curfew at 8 o'clock at night. Anybody caught with a Jewish star at 8 o'clock, after 8 o'clock, would be punished. So we had to be home, everybody, by 8 o'clock at night. Then Jews would disappear, but we didn't know what happened to them. We didn't know if they fled, because I don't know if you remember the history of France. The Germans only marched in so far into France, and there was occupied France and so-called free France under puppet government, the collaborating government in Free France, and it stayed free, so-called, for a good while, and Jews would escape to Free France. So we didn't know what happened to those Jews. And one day, also, before I went away, there was a knock on the door at 5 o'clock in the morning, and my mother asked who it was, and they told her a telegram was to be delivered. So she opened the door, and it was the French police and the Nazis. Instead of a telegram, they came to do a search in the house, and they stayed all day, searched the house. And even unwound all the thread, the bobbins of thread, looking inside. We didn't know what they were looking for. Of course, we found out later that my father had been denounced as being in the French underground, and they were looking for evidence, but they found none. So they stayed all day and they left. And that's when my father's friends told him, you should leave Paris, they'll come back, they're watching you. But he refused. Of course, we didn't know why, but that's why he refused. He was in the French underground. And so this actually was the life that went on in Paris until I left.
Was there food? Was food plentiful?
No. Food, they took all the food, the Germans took all the food out of the country. To get we couldn't find any potatoes, for instance, and rutabaga was, if you want to get a couple pounds of rutabaga, you had to get up in the morning at 4 o'clock and stay in line till 8 or 9 o'clock, till the store opened. And there was a black market, there always is, where you could buy some food. And but we had a ration card, and of course the Jews had Jew stamped on their ration card. And the French law is that after the age of 15, it is a law you have to have an identification card. So all the cards were stamped also Jew. So bread was, everything was rationed, you know. We weren't starving, but we didn't have much. People would go out in the country a lot of the time on bicycles, see if they could gather eggs or chicken or something like that. But we didn't have much to eat, no.
Was there a Nazi influence in the school that you attended after the occupation?
Not really. We didn't stay that long really after the occupation, you know. Not really. I was still in grammar school, so you know I was a child, and no, it just went on pretty normal until they clamped down on the city, as I said. Was all and that didn't last very long, and that's when I was sent out to the country.
Was your sister sent also, or just
No,
you?
no. My sister went on to school because she's almost 5 years older than I am.
See.
Yeah.
And so you went to the country.
So I went to the country, and I was supposed to spend the summer there and then come back. I was a couple months short of my 14th birthday. And one day, I received, we had no telephones in the houses, I received like a message from the post office that I have a phone I guess you call it collect. I had a phone call from Paris that I need to go to the post office to get this party was trying to get me. So I went. It was a small village where I was. I went to the post office, and it was a cousin of mine calling me from Paris. She was a Gentile, and her husband was my father's first cousin. She was married to my father's first cousin, who had been deported to concentration camp already, but not as a Jew, for hard labor, because they hadn't gathered the Jews yet in France.
Now, when he was deported for hard labor, did she know that, or did he just disappear?
No, she knew that. They were getting the young, strong men. They were just getting, picking them for hard labor. They needed labor. And that wasn't just the Jews. That was everybody, the French too. So she calls me, and I thought that was the day of my 14th birthday. It was on the 14th of July, which is also French Independence Day. And I thought she was calling me to wish me a happy birthday. And I was so happy. The people I was staying with had fixed a cake for me. And I started, being very excited. She says, "Be quiet." She says, "Be quiet. I'm not calling you for your birthday." She said, "Your father was taken." And she says, "Your mother and sister are in hiding. And I'm sending you 3,500 francs, which was quite a lot of money there, and in the mail." She says, "You should get it tomorrow. It's going like express mail. And also an address in Dax, which is the southern part of France." And she says, from there, she says, you will get into free France, and then you are to find your mother and sister around Toulouse. It's also in southern part of France. And she says, because she says the Germans have picked up all the Jews in Paris, have rounded up all the Jews. She said, women, men, children, she says.
And this was July 14th, 1942.
It was July 14th. I'm pretty sure it was 42, yes. Yeah, I know it was my birthday. I mean, yeah, it was 42. So, of course, as she says, I can't talk anymore. She says, because I hope I'm not followed. So she says, tomorrow when you get the money, just do this. Follow my instructions. So when I came back to the place where I was staying, there were, I think, 5 more children beside myself. They all started, wishing me, singing happy birthday, and the cake was there as a surprise, and I started crying. And they all thought I was crying because of joy, because it was such a wonderful surprise. And I was crying because I had no mother, no father, and I had nobody else left. And here I was on my own, and I could not, communicate with them. All I knew is that I was supposed to meet them. So,
do you know where your father was sent? Did you know at that time, or when did you find out?
I found out after, much later, when I finally was able to get to my mother and sister, that what happened is the Germans, while I was on vacation and before they took all the women and children, they my father, when he finished work around 5 o'clock or so, always went downstairs, went to the closest cafe, had a little drink, and discussed politics. That was his routine with some men. So around 5 or so, there was a knock on the door, and my mother says when she opened the door, there was these two big men in civilian clothes, and she knew right away they were SS, even though they spoke very good French, but for some reason you could recognize them. And they asked for my father. Well, he wasn't home. And they said, well, where is he? She says, I don't know. What is it? So they said, well, nothing important. We'll come back. Very polite. And they left. And she said she watched through the window. They took off in a big black car. And so she knew they were looking for him. So she went downstairs, and she said she started walking to warn my father and stopped every few steps. So she said she couldn't see anybody following her. And when she arrived where this little cafe where my father always stopped, he was standing on the corner of that street with two men. So she approached him and didn't even have time to say his name. That car pulled up behind her. The two men got out and picked him up and took him. And they put him in a jail called Drancy. My sister told me, and he wrote a little card from there. And
this was in Paris?
That was right outside of Paris, Drancy. That's where they put all the transit people. Actually, before they took all the women and children, when they picked up just political men, you know, for like he was considered as a political, because he was in the French underground. That's where they put him. So he wrote a little card. He said in the little card that he didn't want my mother to come because he knew she would fall apart. So he asked my sister to come and bring him some. No, first that was not the first time. He asked her to come and visit, and he said, "And do come because I'll only be here 5 days, and I'm allowed one card." So my sister went, and that's when he told her. He says, "You know," he says, "this is it." He says, "I don't expect the women and children to be, safe, but just a few days." So he says, "Bring me some soap and shaving cream," and he says, "and flee." He says, "Flee Paris," and he told her who to contact in the French underground, and he says, "If for any reason you become separated," he says, "just flee for your own life." He says, "It won't help you to try to save each other's life," he says, "because this is it." So my sister came back and she gathered some soap and shaving cream, and she said when she came back she never saw him anymore. They had already shipped him out. He didn't stay the 5 days, and they sent him to Birkenau. Of course, we didn't know then. We found out after the war the Germans had left some books with everybody's name, and his name was on there, and when he was shipped out and where.
When did you find out what happened to him at Birkenau?
We really didn't. After the war, when the war was over, a couple of people came back that were deported. One person said they saw him. He only lasted 2 days. They say he didn't want to live. He said that he just went to the gas chamber after 2 days. And then, of course, they didn't see him, being cremated. But so my mother was always hoping, well, he will come back, he will come back. But then after the last person came back from the concentration camp, and then they went, the government started looking through all the books, his name was found. And it already was in the late 40s, maybe right around 1950 that we found out.
And how old was he when he was taken?
44.
So tell me about your trip from Le Mans to your mother in the Toulouse area.
All right. So anyway, so the next morning I had a bicycle and a small suitcase full of summer clothes, and I received the money, which in those days was quite a bit of money. And I went to Tours to catch the train. Tours is not too far from Le Mans.
Did you have an opportunity, to say goodbye, or
Yeah, oh yes, yes, I told them. Of course, they knew I was a Jewish child. These people were not Jewish, but they knew I was a Jewish child. And of course, finally, when I stopped my crying, I told them what happened. Everybody cried, and I told them I had to go. That I had this address in Dax to cross the line. So Le Mans did not have a direct train, and Tours is not far from Le Mans. So they advised that I take my bike and go to Tours and get a direct train from Tours to Dax. Dax was a small resort town right on the border that separated occupied France and free France. So I did that, and when I arrived in Tours to buy a ticket, the station was, and found out when my train was leaving. That was like late afternoon. I didn't have a train till the next morning, and the station was crawling with Germans. I mean, it was a strategic point of some kind. There were a lot of Germans at that, and I became afraid because my only ID card, which I didn't have because I wasn't 15, was my ration card. And my ration card had a stamp, Jew, on it. So I couldn't show it, you know, if somebody, they were asking for IDs because by that time, you know, like I said, they were looking for Jews trying to escape into free France. So I became afraid, and I decided, well, I had money, I'll go to a hotel and spend the night. So I went to a hotel, and they gave me a card to fill out. And so I filled out my name and everything. And at the end, it says age and identification number. Well, I didn't have an identification card, of course, but I didn't need one. So I tell the lady, I said, but I did look older than my age. I was about 14. Maybe I looked like a 16-year-old. So I tell the lady, I don't have an ID card. She says, why not? I said, well, I'm not old enough. So she says, you're not old enough? She says, well, what are you doing in a hotel at your age? How old are you? I said, 14. She said, what are you doing, you know, spending the night? And I said, well, she says, are you Jewish? Well, I said, oh, no, I'm not Jewish. Of course, I was very lucky. We were all quite light and blue eyes in my family. At that time, the Germans were all looking for dark people. That changed. They realized that plenty of Jews were not dark, but that helped me. I said, oh, no, I'm not Jewish. So she said, well, what are you doing in a hotel? So she says, oh, you ran away from home. I know. So she says, I'm going to call the police. And she tried to grab me, so I became very afraid, of course, and I grabbed my bike, and I ran out, and I ran back to the station. I spent all night in the ladies' in the bathroom, you know, until the next morning. Next morning, I bought a ticket, put my bicycle in the last wagon, like luggage, you know, and in those days they had a compartment where 8 people sat together, 4 on one side and 4 on the other, and I got on the train, very happy. Didn't have a pocketbook with me. Everything was in my pocket. I'll tell you why I say that. And we were on the train maybe 15 minutes. The train stops in the middle of nowhere. So one lady says, or one man says, I wonder why we're stopping here. And somebody answers, you know, she says, they do that all the time since the Jews are fleeing occupied France to go into free France. She says the Germans stop the train in the middle of the country and they look for Jews. So here I was thinking, if you tell them you don't have an ID card, I knew that, you know, they automatically, especially if you look older than 15, they say, well, she's Jewish or he's Jewish. And you couldn't show them my ration card because it had Jew on it. So they came, two German soldiers came into our compartment to ask for everybody's ID. Everybody showed them the ID. And came my turn. I took the man's arm that was sitting right by me, and I said, Je suis avec monsieur. I'm with this gentleman. It worked. It worked. They passed on, but I had some explaining to do to the gentleman. Of course, I wasn't going to tell him I was Jewish, because, of course, you never knew. I mean, he might help you, and he may not. So he looks at me. I said, well, you know, I said, I lost my pocketbook. See, I didn't have a pocketbook with me. And I said, you know how these Germans are. I said, if you tell them that you don't have any ID, you know, they automatically take you for Jews. He says, you're right, you're right. He says, you better get off the next step and go to the gendarmerie, which is like the police station, and tell them your story. And he said, so they would make you some kind of a temporary piece of paper, he says, because he says you won't be so lucky the next time. They do this all the time. So next little town, I got off, took my bicycle off the luggage, and then proceeded to ride my bike from around Tours to Dax, which is like 2/3, if you look on the map, like 2/3 of the length of France. It's like close to 1,000 kilometers. And I did it.
And how did you live on that bicycle trip?
Well, I had money, you know, I had money, and I would not stop in hotels. I stopped and slept in, what do you call grange, where they store the hay in the farms, you know. I stopped and slept there. And
did people sell you food?
Yes, well, I had my ration card, so I just gave them the stamps out of my ration card.
And the stamps were not marked?
No, the stamps were not marked. No, just a card. And a lot of the time, see, people would buy false, stamps, you know, that were not, in other words, that like false money, you know. So a lot of the time they would ask you for the cover. But every time they asked me for the cover, I would say I lost it, because I always stopped in little dinky, you know, country places where, so they'd say, well, okay, you know, they were not very particular as long as you give them the stamp. So I was lucky that way. It was a long, long journey, and it took me probably close to a month to get there.
Did you encounter any Germans along the way after you got off the train?
Yes, but I didn't look suspicious. I was just, you know, riding, you know, a bicycle with a little tiny little suitcase. So that part was pretty peaceful. As I say, I slept, you know, and I had money. So that part was pretty peaceful until I arrived in Dax. Well, when I arrived in Dax, it was crawling with Germans.
Now, Dax is in what part of France?
It's in the southern part of France. It's, like I said, it's a little resort town close to the Atlantic on that side, and close to the Pyrenees, close to Spain also.
I see.
And that was crawling with Germans, because the Jews were coming to that little town, a lot of them, to go across, to find themselves across the border into free France. So I had this address, but of course I didn't know the town. So I said, well, maybe I should, there were no taxis because there were no gas in the country. The Germans took all the gasoline out. So the transportation was horse and buggies. So you hired a horse and a buggy. So so I arrived to the little train station where all the horse and buggies were in line there, and comes out of the train station a family from Paris that I went to school with, the oldest girl, a mother, father, 5 children. The oldest of the 5 children was my age. Of course, we were very happy to see each other. What are you doing here? What are you doing here? We were all doing the same thing. So they said, where are you going? They had an address too, but they didn't know where it was, not knowing the town. So they said, well, let's all get in the same, when I say buggy, they were big, big buggies. So we called one, and we showed him where we were going, and he said, well, he says, it's on the way. He says, but to me, if you didn't have your bike, I would take you. He said, but your bike, I can't take all that, and a bike too. So we kissed, you know, and we said so long, hoping to see you soon. And I went to the buggy right behind me where 2 nuns were sitting. And he said, okay, he would take us together, you know, the 3 of us in my bicycle. And as their buggy took off ahead of me, and was stopped immediately by German soldiers and took the whole family. And, of course, they didn't stop us. So that was an unbelievable escape for me. So I arrived to this address that I had, and this lady happened to be a lady who owned a little business. And she was just doing this. She was not making any money, just to help Jewish people.
And she was not Jewish?
She was not Jewish, no. And I was pretty dirty by that time. I hadn't had a bath all that time. The first thing she did was let me shower and rest, and she said, let me spend the night there. And she said the next day these two young men would come and it would take me across the border. Well, sure enough, the next morning, two young men came. They were not much older than I was, maybe 15 and 16. They were little peasant boys. And they knew, also not Jewish, they knew, and I paid them, but not much. It was more like a little, like you would give a boy some money to go out on the town on Saturday night. So they took me, and we walked across fields and across rivers, and then we slept in a barnyard, what do you call that?
Barn?
A barn. And then the next morning at 5 o'clock, they said, we were on a small country road. They said, here you are, you're in Free France. I didn't have much money left anyway, but so I...
Did you know then where you were in Free France?
No.
You were just out in the country?
Yeah, but they told me, they said, just follow that road until you arrive in Pau, P-A-U, which was a good-sized city.
And at this point, you were on foot? You didn't have your bicycle anymore?
Huh?
You did not
No,
have
I still had
you
my
still had your bicycle?
No, I still had my bicycle. No, I kept my bicycle. At this point, I still had it. And my little suitcase was closed. And they said that they said you follow the sign. When you arrive in Pau, then you can call your family. You won't be very far from Toulouse. And I had an address in Toulouse, and my family my mother and sister was supposed to be in Groslay, which is a suburb of Toulouse. And so I was very happy, got on my bike and was riding on this little country road. And every so often I noticed signs with cut trees across on one side of the road saying, attention, attention, Achtung, Achtung, if you cross that point you will be shot on sight. And then there was a lone German soldier standing guard in a little guardhouse. And this went on for quite a couple miles. I've been quite a little while. Then I realized that the other side was Free France. I was still in occupied France. So I don't think that they did that. Well, I'm sure they didn't do it on purpose. I think they were just, like kids, and they thought, whatever, they made a mistake because there was no reason for them, to lead me on wrong. So, so I knew I had to. The other side was woods. And so I knew I had to get on the other side. So I rode for a little while and realized that these guardhouses were pretty far apart. So I grabbed my bike at one point and I said, I have to run across these cut trees and get on the other side. And I did. And in the process of doing that, all I remember was shots. And that's all I remember. And before I suppose several hours passed by. It was dark, and somebody, I didn't know it was a man at the time, I was laying on my face, and somebody was just touching my shoulder and shaking my shoulder a little bit, saying, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, you're in Free France, you're in Free France. And I looked up, there was this old peasant, and he said, don't be afraid, but don't make any noise. He says, are you Jewish? I said, yeah. So he said, well, you're in Free France. He says, you got shot at. He says, I heard the Germans. He says, but I couldn't come and get you until it got dark. He says, this happens every day. He says, come. So I didn't I still had my bicycle, but I had lost my clothes, the suitcase, I guess, but I went across. So he said, come. And he took me to the house, and I had blood all over my face. What had happened, the fall on my face knocked me out and got all my teeth loose, and I was bleeding from all my gums and, the dried blood. Because, like I said, several hours had gone by, and they had shot at me and tore my whole blouse from a bullet, but never entered. It ricocheted, and they had a big, a big scratch on my back. And that's how I fell. So he gave me, some water and told me to wash up. It was in the middle of the night, And then his wife came down, and she says to him, you brought me a Jew in here. She says, you know what's going to happen. He said, be quiet, Kate. You see, she's just a child. How old are you? 14. She says, but she says, you know that they come across the line, the Germans, and they look for the Jews. They know that there are some hiding here, and if they find her here, they're going to kill us all. And they had several children sleeping upstairs. So anyway, he begged, and she let him give me bread and cheese and some fruit and some clothes, because my clothes, some peasants' clothes that they gave me, it was a handkerchief with the food, and they sent me on my way. They told me, you know, to sleep in some bar, not on the ground. She wouldn't let me. He wanted to, but she wouldn't let me. She was afraid. So I went on with my bicycle. And
did they point you in the direction toward Toulouse?
Yes. I went on to Pau and then on to Toulouse. And it was not all that safe even in Free France back then, because there were no Germans at the time, but the gendarmes, they had a certain amount of collaborators, you know, with the Germans, were picking up Jews and putting them into camps. If they had an address where they could stay, it's different. But somebody like me, see, they put them into camps and kept them there because they knew that eventually the Germans would come further down and get the rest of the Jews.
Now, this would have been around the middle of August of 42?
It was later. I think it was because it was about September. Yeah, about September. So I was between. So I arrived in Toulouse, where I had an address too. Because I had several addresses, and when I arrived in Toulouse, at this address, my mother and my sister had come through there a couple months before, and the people who weren't Jewish too told me that they hoped my mother didn't commit suicide, because she was so besides herself that she abandoned me, even though she didn't really, you know. And they had to flee Paris with the help of this cousin, by the way. She helped them get to the train station, and because they said that she figured I hadn't shown up for so long that I was dead. And so I stayed there for a night, and they fed me, and they put me on the train to go to Groslay. Well, not really a train, it was a bus. There was no train, on a big, like a Greyhound bus. And so I arrived in Groslay, and
Groslay was a small town?
Yeah, it was a town of 10,000, a population of 10,000. What had happened, see, a lot of the Jews had fled Belgium, because the Germans had invaded Belgium and all of occupied France to the south of France. And a lot of Belgian Jews had settled in Groslay because they had the tannery. That's where they treated the raw leather. And a lot of these Jewish people from Belgium knew that trade, and they knew this little town, so they could get work there with permission. The Jews were also had to register as Jews there, even in Free France, but they could get work. So we had cousins there from Belgium who had fled Belgium. So that's how my mother and my sister went to this little town. And so when I arrived with my bicycle, like 2 months later, and my mother saw me, and she had lost like 30 pounds, and she fainted. And she said that she had become so depressed, you know, that everybody was so fearful for her life, that, you know, because she felt like I didn't survive, and that was her fault. And of course she felt it was her fault that my father was taken too. So husband first and child after would have been too much for her. So I made it. That was my first experience during the occupation.
And then did you stay in Groslay with your mother and sister for a little while?
We stayed for a little while. Us as women, we couldn't work. We didn't have to. Well, there was no work, but as Jews, for some reason, we didn't. The men could work, but the women couldn't. Well, I guess the men could work because they had the specialty that they could do, but the women couldn't. And after 14, the age of 14, there was no school. I would have had to be sent to a boarding school, and my mother didn't have any money to send me to a boarding school. So my sister, who was 5 years older and had gone to a very good, I guess you call it a commercial school. She had learned to be a stenographer in Paris. So we knew in that little town, we knew this non-Jewish man, very influential. He owned the newspaper of the town, and he had access to city hall and to the official stamp, you know. So he said to her, "Why don't you go back to Paris under a false name? I'll make you a false identification paper, a fake name, but that person exists, you know, because see, the Germans got wise. They knew that Jewish people were getting false identification cards. So what they did, if they made a control, you know, and they said, show me your papers, if they suspected you might be Jewish, they would look up in the archives if you were really registered there. And if it was false, and you weren't registered there, if it was just something out of a blue sky, they would still take you. But if you were registered there, then you existed. So what this man was very clever, he would pick names from like 2,000 kilometers away, not from that same town where it was so easy for the Germans to find out, because you might meet that person. That person really existed. So what he did, he was also in the underground, and he was helping Jewish people. So he made her a false identification card of a person that existed in Lille, which was like at the other part of France. And he told her to go back to Paris and get a job and work, because we had no money, you know, and maybe help us. So she did. She went back to Paris and got a job and worked as a Christian, and got a little room at the YWCA, you know. Of course, she was, I was about 14, so she was 19 years old. And still, I couldn't go to school. So
now, did you and your mother stay in Groslay?
We stayed in Groslay, yes, because my mother had a strong accent anyway when she spoke French. She had a Polish accent, so that you couldn't make her any false IDs, you know. I was too young, you see. So we stayed there a good little while till we had no money left at all. And in the meantime, the Germans would cross the border into Free France, and every night they would pick up 1 or 2 Jewish families, because they were not supposed to take the Jews, but they would disappear. So this same Monsieur Letard, who made that identification card for my sister, said, you know, he said, he called, there were about 20, 25 Jewish families, and he sort of took them all under his wing, and he called a meeting at his house, and he says, you know, he says, if you don't leave this town, he says, you will all be picked up. So he says, we're going to have to make some kind of arrangement. Oh yeah, other things have happened in between. You know, there's so much has happened. It's hard for me to try to keep everything, you know, following everything. My mother, since I couldn't go to school while she was there, she had a brother who had served in the French Foreign Legion, because this brother, who had asked for political asylum, wanted to serve in the French army when the war broke out between France and Germany. But since he had become a man without a country, he lost his nationality, right, his Polish nationality, when he deserted. He had become what they call apatride. The French would not let him serve in the French army, but they said, if you want to serve France, then volunteer in the French Foreign Legion. So he volunteered in the French Foreign Legion, and he did the whole North African, from Sidi Bel Abbès, you know, what is it, Rommel, the Desert Fox that they were fighting. So he did all that campaign, and then he got out of the French Foreign Legion, came to Marseille, He didn't want, of course, he was a butcher, but he had a little butcher shop in Paris that the Germans did not take from him because he went away in the army, so he closed up his shop, you know, and it just stayed closed. So he came back to Marseille, and my mother sent me to Marseille to him so I could go to school.
Now this was what, October, November?
No,
42?
this was later than that because I had been in Grolais several months. I will say maybe 6 months.
So
yeah.
Spring of 1943, maybe.
Yeah. So he had a hotel room and he had a job, you know, not very good job, but in a butcher shop. But anyway, she thought that would be best for me. Well, come to find out, the concierge, which is the keeper of the building of the hotel, would not let me stay with him because that was rented for one person, and she just wouldn't let me stay with him. So what I did, I went to school every day, and every night I would do my homework on a bench on the boulevard, and we would wait till she turned her light out and go to bed, and then he would smuggle me into his bedroom. Sometimes we were lucky it was 10 o'clock, sometimes it was 2 o'clock in the morning. So that's how I spent my time with him for a while, but it was not possible. I mean, I couldn't live like that. I just would drag myself to school. Sometimes it was 2 or 3 hours sleep, very little food. So
and Marseille was in Free France?
Marseille was in Free France, yes. Mm-hmm. So my mother heard that under 16, the Red Cross was sending children to the United States. They were able to get the Jewish children under 16 to be sent to the United States from Free France. So she asked me to come back, and she was going to send me to the United States. Well, of course, I would never think of leaving her. I started crying, and I said, wherever she goes, I'll go. She said, you remember what your father said? But that did not count. So I refused to go to the United States. So I stayed with my mother a little bit in Grolais. In the meantime, our Belgian, the Germans picked up all the Belgian Jews that had fled Belgium. There were about 6 families. So our Belgian cousins were picked up to be deported to concentration camp.
Did you see them again?
No. That was 3 brothers who were about my mother's age, their wives. One had a son and a daughter, and one had 2 sons who, when the Germans came, those 2 sons were not home. They came in the morning early, and they didn't take my mother or me. They were just looking for Belgian Jews. I guess they had a system, you know. And the two sons were not home. One was 18 and one was 19. One was spending the night with the son of the French family, non-Jewish family that was employing them, those leather goods. And one had gone out, he had a little garden in the fields. We knew where they were. So, of course, the Germans didn't say, that they were taking these people to concentration camp. They were sending them to interrogate them about Belgium. But we knew, of course. So how
did you know?
Well, because we had already fled, Paris, and my father had told us all this, and then we had gotten all these letters from Poland. I mean, we really didn't know they were burning Jews. No, still didn't know they were actually burning Jews in concentration camps, but we knew they were doing away with them, they were mistreating them, working them to death. I mean, that much, we knew. So my sister went to the field. I forgot to tell you, my sister had come back from Paris because with her work, she could not support herself. She just did not make enough money, to pay for everything. And so she had written, and she said that she just, my mother even had to send her food that we didn't even have, once in a while. So she says, maybe I could come back and hide there, And so my sister had just come back, because we had this meeting with this man. He was going to help us anyway, she says, and maybe we'll do whatever he decides to do that we should do, we'll do it together. So she happened to have just been back, and so she fled to the field and told one of the two brothers what had happened. Well, he started crying, he wanted to come back home and go with his parents, and she wouldn't let him. She pushed him into an outdoor house, where they have, and she says, I'm not going to let you go, I'm not going to let you go, it's just, being killed. And the other boy, the people that he was spending the night with hid him. And then after a few days went by, my sister finally, he quieted down, and he stayed in that outhouse, and we would take him food every day. And for a few days, and after things looked sort of quiet, the French people who were hiding the other boy took the two boys and sent them off to Savoie. It's in the Alps, and to the French underground. And they survived. They stayed in the French underground till the war was over. And they survived.
What happened to you and your sister and your mother?
All right, so
after
this
that?
man, Mr. Lothar, called a meeting, and this was the period, this period here. And this is me at 15, my sister. That's Mr. Lothar's daughter. And she was going with him, Maurice, he was a Jewish boy, and hiding in that little village from Paris. These two, Henri and Suzanne, were also Jewish children. She was my age, he was maybe 16. They were deported.
And this picture was taken in 1943?
This picture was taken in 1943. I didn't get it till last year. This Maurice married her, and I hadn't seen him for 40-some odd years, and we had a reunion last year when I was in Paris. He told me about the picture, and he had one made for me, one for my sister. So I just got it in May. Actually, not last year, this year, in May. So he called us, and he said, he says, go into the townhouse, get the official stamp out, and he says, I'm going to buy ID cards, blank ID cards, and this is also the period of the, excuse me, this is my false identification card, and this is a blank ID card. You buy it like that, then you put your picture on there, and he says, I'm going to get a list from people who exist, and each one should correspond pretty much to your age. He says, looks, he says, I don't know, because he didn't know those people. He says, but age-wise, they have to be, I wasn't 15 at the time, but they have to be 15 to have an ID card. So he says, I have to have someone that's at least 15. And he says, then he says, you all have to leave and go back into occupied France. He says, Free France now is more dangerous than occupied France, because all the Jews that were not taken in Free France were now sitting ducks in Free France. So he says, now, as Gentiles, and you go back, he says, to occupied France, he says, you will be much safer. Well, this uncle who was in Marseille had met a Jewish girl also there, hiding, and from